Hello, viewers, and welcome to my channel, Jackson's Journal. The rescue that I'm going to tell you about today occurred on June 25th, 1988, and there were four people who participated in this rescue. The main character in this rescue was James Kopp, and then myself, and then two other people who are a married couple who wish to remain anonymous. So I will just give them the pseudonyms of Fred and Wilma. Anyway, there was this rescue was covered by one news media outlet in Houston. It was Channel 2 TV KPRC Houston, which was the NBC affiliate. So before I show you the news footage of the rescue that was covered, let me first remind you to do not forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. So anyway, let's get to the news coverage of the rescue, then I'll explain the rest on the other side. Roll it.
Brick, and it locked this onto this, and this part went around the man's neck. So that he couldn't be moved. They probably wasted, $10,000 or $15,000 worth of city money, taxes, because the people wouldn't cooperate with us to get the locks off.
Police say 5 officers joined a half-dozen firefighters and paramedics trying to free the man who planned to stay put.
Everybody has a right to protest, but they can do it in a civil manner. They have the right to be out on the street, not to come in and interrupt other people who have just as much right to their feelings as they do. I'm really tired of it.
Novick says the protest did not shut down the clinic. Some 18 patients and family members were moved to another office. Novick says abortions have been performed at the clinic since 1985. Protesters have picketed outside before, but this is the first time they've...
Now that was a 48-second clip by Channel 2 News of the rescue. Now, there's a lot of details about this rescue that they were not able to cover in just 48 seconds, so let me fill in some of the gaps. For one thing that's very notable is this rescue was done in a high-rise building. The abortion mill was located on the 10th floor of a 20-story high-rise building. It was called the Arena Towers 2, located on 7324 Southwest Freeway in Houston, Texas. Now, the other key fact that you need to know is Jim was not just locked to one block. Okay, he was locked to 2 blocks. So you saw the block in the earlier picture, and here it is again. This is the block his neck was locked to. But one thing we didn't talk about, or the news report didn't talk about, was his feet were also locked to a block, and it looks something like this. Now, the block that was actually used wasn't quite as big as the block you see in this picture. It really looked more like this. At any rate, so you might be wondering, well, how did you guys, you 4 people, manage to get Jim Kopp and 2 blocks up on the 10th floor of a building where the abortion mill is located? Well, if you really want to know, stick around and I'll give you the rest of the story. Now, before I give you the rest of the story, let me first tell you about Jim Kopp and how I knew him, what he was like back in 1988. Now, most of the people who were involved in the rescue movement were basically weekend warriors. We all had jobs and we had families to support. And, we would do our pro-life activist stuff on the weekends and vacations and holidays and stuff like that. But the movers and shakers of the rescue movement, this would be, the Joe Scheidlers, the Randall Terrys, the Joan Andrews Bell, John Ryan, guys like that, and even Jim Kopp. They were full-time rescuers. That was their job, full-time. That was their ministry. That's what they did all the time. And of course, Jim Kopp at the time in 1988, when I met him, he had already become a legend in his own right because he did some very exotic rescues. In July 19th, 1986, he did a rescue with Brian Hoffel where they took in a 6-foot sewer pipe into an abortion mill and locked themselves to the sewer pipe. Okay. And then in October 25th, an abortion mill in San Jose, California, Jim Kopp took a shielded kryptonite bike lock and locked himself to the abortionist table. And they could not cut the lock, so they dismantled the table to get him out of there. And of course, in Oakland, California, he did a staircase rescue where he locked himself to a staircase, and that occurred on December 20th, 1986. And then in August 22nd, 1987, he did a rescue in Washington, D.C., using a shielded kryptonite bike lock. And I'll get more into that later. But the way I met Jim at Operation Rescue New York. This is the first week of May in New York. He was on Randall Terry's staff. He was a part of Operation Rescue and helping that program get along. So that's what he did. And during the evenings, we would have dinners at the restaurant. Now, I already knew who Jim was because I read about him and heard about him, but I finally got to meet him at the restaurants, and I was, of course, interested in his lock shielding techniques. Also, I told him about what I developed with the lock and block system and how I did one rescue where we had a block and we locked ourselves to the block, and he was very interested in that. So Jim and I had a lot to talk about, and we got to know each other quite well when we visited a lot in the evenings and at the restaurants. At any rate, at the end of the rescues, a series of rescues we did in New York, there were 4 to be exact, and Friday night as we were going home, Jim was hanging around the van, and I said, "Oh, well, it was nice to meet you and hear about your stuff, and thank you for coming here to see us off." And he said, "See you off? No, I'm coming with you to Houston." And I go, "Really? No way." And he goes, "Yeah, way." And so he came to Houston with us. And so in June, early part of June, Jim called me up on the phone and says, "Hey, Matthew, I want to do a rescue later this month, and I want to use some of your blocks. I want to use your block and lock techniques, and I want to shield one of those locks on one of those blocks." So he wanted me to work with him. So this was a very exciting opportunity for me because I get to work with a legend and doing a rescue because this guy had a wealth of knowledge. At that point, I had only done 6 rescues. So this was going to be rescue number 7, and where he had done 20 plus, maybe 30 rescues at that time. And so I was really eager and I felt it a privilege and an honor to be able to work with Jim. So let me tell you about that. So here we were, Jim Kopp, myself, and Fred and Wilma. and we were at Fred and Wilma's house, sitting in their garage, and we were brainstorming. Okay, we want to do a rescue in a high-rise building where the abortion mill is. How are we going to get Jim Kopp up there, and how are we going to get 2 blocks up there that Jim Kopp can lock himself to? That was the dilemma, is how are we going to execute this? And so we were brainstorming in the garage and said, well, they're just in the garage. There happened to be a wheelchair sitting in the garage, and it was just your average wheelchair. It looks something like this. Okay. And we thought, hey, why don't we use this wheelchair? We could put with a wheelchair, there's some space underneath the seat of the wheelchair where you could put something. So we figured out, okay, why don't we build a small block that would fit underneath the wheelchair, and then Jim could lock his feet to that block. And then we have the other block that he locks his neck to. We thought like that, and we were thinking, yeah, we could use this wheelchair to wheel Jim and the block, and up there. Later on, we figured out, okay, why don't we have Jim pre-locked to the block, his feet pre-locked, okay, and then so he'd be sitting in the wheelchair with his feet already locked to the block with his shielded lock. And then we would cover it up with a blanket. And in this picture here, you see this Mexican blanket right here. Well, that was the blanket we used to cover up the lock and block so we could wheel Jim past security and not get caught or draw any suspicion. So the scheme we came up with was Wilma would pose as the pre-abortive mother going to the abortion mill. Jim would pose as the husband of the pre-abortive mother. Okay, so Jim was disabled, but he wanted to be with the pre-abortive mother to show his moral support for her abortion. And of course, I played the orderly that would push the wheelchair. Okay, look, I know this sounds very crazy. It was, but the scheme worked. Now, Fred, his job was to pose as a delivery service guy, delivering a package, and we actually put the other block in a cardboard box in a package, and we put it a legitimate address, the address of the abortion mill, on the package. So what we would do is me, Jim, and Wilma, we would go up to the abortion mill. I would jettison Jim and the block from the wheelchair, and then they would lay down, and then Fred, who acted as the delivery service guy, would bring the other block, and we'd lock them on. Now, that was the theory we came up with. How are we going to do it? Well, I measured the dimensions of the cavity or the space underneath the seat of the wheelchair and built a block with an attachment where you could attach a lock to so it would fit into the wheelchair. Then Jim designed his shield that you put on the lock to protect the lock from the grinders, because the grinder can take out a kryptonite bike lock. But if you put these pipes, put the bike lock in a pipe with tar in the pipes, when it heats up, it turns to oil and neutralizes the blade that would be grinding at the lock. Okay, so anyway, what we did is I built the block, then I gave the block to Jim. Jim did his thing, and then we had to figure out a way to put the block underneath the wheelchair, underneath the seat of the wheelchair, so we can push it around. So it had to roll. So we had to get some metal wires and rods, things like that. We also had to figure out how to um, pull a lever, create a lever that we could pull where the block would drop. Once we parked the wheelchair, we would want to pull the wheelchair aside. Once I pulled the wheelchair aside, Wilma, who was posing as the pre-abortive mother, would take the wheelchair and take it out of the abortion mill. Okay. Now, one of the things we discovered after Jim built his kryptonite or his lock shielding techniques on the kryptonite lock itself, and we actually put it in the wheelchair and was able to rig it with rods and wires and different kinds of metal. Then we would put Jim in the wheelchair, lock him up, and then I would push the wheelchair with Jim in it around on the street in the cul-de-sac, up and down the sidewalk, practicing handling. One of the things we first discovered, putting the cement block in underneath the wheelchair seat, is you know how the front wheels of the wheelchair swivel? Okay, well, we had lost a lot of our turning radius. You could not do a sharp turn, a 90-degree turn with the wheelchair because the block took the wheelchair's ability to do it. So if you wanted to do a sharp 90-degree turn, you had to take the wheelchair and pull it back and do a wheelie of sorts, then pivot. Okay. So I had to learn how to manage the wheelchair and pivot the wheelchair with Jim in it and the block. Okay, so that was a challenge. I had to go get the dimensions of the elevator because once we wheeled Jim and the wheelchair and the block in the elevator, we had to do a 180-degree turn in the elevator. Okay, so we had to get the dimensions of the elevator and practice doing a 180 pivot inside the elevator. So then when we got to the floor where the abortion mill was, we could just roll the wheelchair forward. The wheelchair could not go backwards. We could not make the wheelchair go in reverse because of the block. So anyway, it came game day in the morning of. We did exactly everything I just said. We put in the parking lot, put Jim in the wheelchair, locked him down, then took the Mexican blanket, put it over his legs so nobody could see the lock in the block and the block under the wheelchair. And we just wheeled Jim in, and it went according to plan. All that practice that we did maneuvering the wheelchair on the sidewalk and out on the streets, and practice turning in the elevator. All that work paid off. This is probably the most highly technical engineered rescue I've ever been on. So we had to do a lot of engineering in terms of how to figure out how to get that wheelchair to carry a block that probably weighed about 50 or 60 pounds. And then you had Jim Kopp himself, who weighed, I don't know what he weighed, 150 pounds, or I don't know what his weight was. But anyway, you got that weight to deal with, and the wheelchair had to handle it. And I had to learn how to manipulate and maneuver the wheelchair. But we successfully got the wheelchair and both blocks up 10 flights in the high rise and got it in the abortion mill. Now, for the rest of the story, I'm going to tell you what actually happened in terms of the abortionist and everything else. The biggest concern that we had from the get-go was getting past the security desk when we entered the high rise on the first floor because you had a security guard you had to go by, and this is why we did the wheelchair scheme and with Wilma posing as the pre-abortive mother and and Jim Kopp posing as the father, the husband of the pre-abortive mother. And that was, so we were successful in getting past the security desk and making it to the elevator. Once we got to the elevator, it was pretty much smooth sailing. All three of us got in, and of course, Wilma knew to get in the far corner of the elevator car so I could do my 180-degree pivot inside the elevator car as it was climbing up to the 10th floor where the abortion mill was. Once we got out, we just rolled in. Wilma was the pre-abortive mother. She posed as the pre-abortive mother, and she opened the front door to the abortion mill to allow me to wheel Jim into the abortion mill. I would say the waiting room was a little bit more than half full, and so I had to negotiate the wheelchair and Jim with the patrons in the waiting room, and kind of bumped one of the ladies that was going to get an abortion. I said, "Oh, excuse me, ma'am." And so what I did is once I got Jim into position, I put the locks or the brakes on the big wheels of the wheelchair, went in front of Jim, picked Jim up, and I held Jim. Then Wilma, what she did is while I was holding Jim, she unlocked the wheelchair, took the wheelchair out of the waiting room, and then she was never to be seen again. And then I just laid Jim down on the floor. By the time I had Jim laid down on the floor, Fred, who was posing as the delivery service guy, brought in the block. I mean, the timing couldn't have been perfect. And so I took the block out of the box, and the extra kryptonite lock I had on me, I don't know if I had it on my pants or wherever I had it, or maybe Jim was holding it, whatever, but we had it all pre-planned out. And so then I locked Jim down, his neck down to the block, which you saw in the picture there. So there you go. And once we were done, now it didn't take long for the abortion mill staff to know that they were under siege, that some pro-lifers had breached security and came into the system, and they moved everybody in the waiting room out into another area of the abortion mill. Usually they have waiting rooms in the pre-op and post-op recoveries and stuff like that. That's probably where they moved them. At any rate, it was just me and Jim and Fred. We stayed with Jim, obviously, because you can't leave Jim by himself, totally defenseless, locked to 2 blocks. So we provided some sort of security. The abortionist came out into the waiting room and said, "Who are you? What are you doing?" Blah, blah, blah. At the time, I didn't have the savvy to act like a pre-aborted father. And I says, "Yeah, my wife's here to get an abortion. We got this nut here," or something like that, because deception wasn't in my nature to do that. But that's what I probably should have done. But suffice it to say, the abortionists realized that me and Fred were pro-lifers assisting Jim, and the abortionist was very hostile, very angry that we were shutting down his operation. And at any rate, the nurse, opened the door to the waiting room and looked in, and Jim was in a Zen kind of mode. I mean, he was totally out of it from the get-go. From the time we met at the restaurant and then sat him in the chair, locked him down, his feet down, and went in there, he was just totally oblivious to what was going on. He was just like zenning out. So, like, he was laying on the floor zenning out, and the nurse saw him. And it was a black nurse, and she'd say, "He's on drugs. He's on drugs," stuff like that. And she'd say, "Get your ass off this floor. this here is a medical facility, and all that. And I was just sitting there. Now, I sat down in the waiting room because by that time the security guard came up to the 10th floor and he realized that he got fooled. Okay. And he detained us as well as the abortionist. And I'm sure I could have left if I really, really wanted to, because I was a bigger guy than they were. But again, we had to protect Jim because he was defenseless, and you leave Jim defenseless, because he was also wearing handcuffs in addition to having his feet locked down and his neck locked to a block. So at any rate, while I was sitting in the chair, they had called the police. The police were on his way. The keys to both locks were in my pocket. And I said to myself, man, I got to get rid of these keys because, if they catch me with the keys, then they're going to unlock Jim and then rescue over. We did all this hard work and all this engineering and practice, and I'm not about to blow this rescue because I have the keys on me. So when there was a break in the action, a lull, and the doctor left, or the abortionist left. I shouldn't call him a doctor, but left the room temporarily. I took the keys out of my pocket and stuffed them between the cushions of a seat that I was sitting in. So, and in hopes that they would never find them. As far as I know, those keys are still there. I don't know if they were ever found. But anyway, the police show up. They look at the gem and the lock and all that, and the cop said, well, where are the keys? And he looks at me, and I didn't say anything. I just looked at him back, and he raises his voice, where are the keys? Like him raising his voice is going to change things, like, oh, they're right here, officer. No, I wasn't going to. And so I let him raise his voice and shout, where are the keys, all he wants, because I wasn't about to give up those keys. At any rate, long story short, they arrested me and Fred. So they took us, put us in handcuffs and took us out. We went limp because we would have left. It wasn't a true trespassing charge. It's only trespassing when the property owners ask you to leave and you refuse to leave. Had they asked, we would have left because the police were there. They would have protected Jim. Okay. So, but anyway, they arrested us unlawfully, I think. And so it was just Jim. And then that's when they brought the fire department. They brought a locksmith to unlock. The locksmith managed to unlock the kryptonite lock that was locked to his neck, but they could not unlock the lock that was shielded on the foot lock. So the fire department came, they put Jim and the block on a gurney, and then they wheeled Jim out. Okay. Then they took Jim to the firehouse where they have more tools and equipment, and they detached him from the block there at the firehouse. And then maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours later, Jim joined us at the jail. We met up with Jim. Fred and I were already in the jail, and Jim showed up. So that basically is the story of the Jim Kopp Kaper, the high-rise rescue. Here's my mugshot from that arrest. There you go. Anyway, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.